Hey everyone, and welcome back. Are you ready to dive in?
Always. What are we looking at today?
Well, today I thought it would be interesting to take a look at Kamala Harris.
Oh, wow.
We're going to go through her whole Wikipedia page and see what we can find.
I always love these Wikipedia deep dives. You never know what you're going to find.
Right, and I think a lot of people, they know her as a politician, obviously. As the vice president, she was the first female and first Black and first Asian American vice president.
Yeah, she's definitely had a very historic career.
Yeah, so a lot of people know her from that, but maybe they don't know some of the earlier details of her life. So that's what we're going to do today.
I'm ready.
So Kamala Harris was born in Oakland, California
Yeah.
in 1964 to immigrant parents. Her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, was an Indian biologist, and her father, Donald J. Harris, was an Afro-Jamaican economist.
Wow, so they came from very different backgrounds.
Yes, and actually they met at UC Berkeley.
Oh, how interesting.
So, I mean, just think about that. UC Berkeley in the 60s, such an important time and place, a real hotbed for all sorts of, intellectual and political activity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that environment probably had a big impact on Kamala Harris's development, don't you think? Like, it seems like that's where those seeds of her intellectual curiosity were planted.
Yeah, I think so.
And her drive,
Yeah.
to make a difference.
It really makes you wonder how that early environment shaped her worldview.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Berkeley, though. She also spent time in Midwest college towns and even Montreal.
Really?
So she got exposure to a lot of different cultures and viewpoints right from a young age.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That kind of upbringing definitely shapes you, right? Like being exposed to all those different perspectives.
Totally. And that probably influenced her approach to politics later on. I mean, it makes you wonder how much those early experiences shaped her views. So fast forward a bit. She went to Howard University, which is a historically Black university.
Oh, wow.
Pretty deliberate choice, don't you think?
Absolutely. It shows she really wanted to connect with her heritage.
And while she was there, she joined the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority,
Okay.
which is really interesting, right? It shows how she was already getting involved in social and political issues.
Yeah, like finding her community.
Exactly. And she didn't stop there. She went on to get her law degree from UC Hastings.
Wow. She was just going for it.
Yeah, and she even served as president of the Black Law Students Association.
So impressive. Like even back then, she was a leader.
Right. You can really see the beginnings of her leadership skills and her dedication to social justice.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about her professional life, because this is where things start to get really interesting. She began her career as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County and quickly developed a reputation for being a tough prosecutor.
Okay, so like right out of the gate, she was making a name for herself.
Exactly. Now, her next move sparked some controversy. She was appointed to state boards by her then-boyfriend, Willie Brown, who was a very powerful figure in California politics.
So right away, people were questioning whether her success was due to her connections or her own merit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that's followed her throughout her career.
I bet. It's hard to escape those kinds of criticisms when you're in the public eye.
So from there, she went on to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, where she focused on career criminals and implemented those 3 strikes policy.
Oh, the ones that were really popular back then.
Right. It was a tough-on-crime era, and she definitely took a hard line.
So it's interesting to see that side of her, given her later focus on criminal justice reform, right?
It is, and it shows how much the political landscape has shifted. But even back then, she wasn't just about punishment. She also spearheaded a program called Back on Track, which aimed to reduce recidivism by offering job training and support to low-level offenders.
Well, that's interesting. So even then, she was thinking about alternative solutions, trying to address the root causes of crime.
Right. And in 2003, she made history again by becoming San Francisco's first person of color elected as district attorney.
Wow, that's a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, and it really solidified her position as a rising star in California politics.
It must felt incredible to break those barriers.
Oh, I'm sure. Now, one thing that drew criticism during her time as DA was her truancy initiative.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about that.
The goal was to reduce crime by keeping kids in school, but some people felt like it unfairly penalized low-income families who might be facing challenges beyond their control.
That makes sense. It's a tricky issue, right? Trying to balance accountability with understanding the complexities of people's lives.
For sure.
So we're seeing this interesting tension in her early career, like a mix of these hardline approaches, but also these attempts to find alternative solutions.
Right, and that tension is something we're going to see play out throughout her career. So in 2010, she continued to break barriers by becoming California's first female, African American, and South Asian American Attorney General.
Wow, another historic first.
I know. As Attorney General, she focused a lot on consumer protection, securing those massive settlements against corporations like Quest Diagnostics and J.P. Morgan Chase. She really made a name for herself as a fighter for everyday people.
Yeah, it sounds like she was really taking on those big corporations, holding them accountable.
Mm-hmm. She also tackled those predatory foreclosure practices during the housing crisis and was really involved in shaping those early data privacy policies with tech giants like Apple and Google.
Oh, wow. So she was really ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much her work back then is still relevant today.
Definitely.
Then in 2016, she was elected to the U.S. Senate.
Wow, her career is just nonstop.
Right. And of course, that made her the second Black woman and the first South Asian American senator.
It's amazing how she keeps breaking barriers.
In the Senate, she became known for her sharp questioning of Trump administration officials during those high-profile hearings.
Oh, yeah, I remember those. Like, especially during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. She was tough.
Oh, yeah. And it really put her on the national stage.
For sure. It was clear she wasn't afraid to challenge those in power.
Mm-hmm. And it's in the Senate where we really see her political position start to take shape. She's advocating for gun control, the DREAM Act, cannabis legalization, healthcare reform, tax reform.
It sounds like she's got a pretty progressive agenda.
Yeah, and she's not afraid to be vocal about her beliefs.
So all of this leads up to her run for president in 2020, right?
Exactly. And even though she didn't win the Democratic nomination, it really raised her national profile and ultimately led to her being chosen as Joe Biden's running mate.
That was such a historic moment.
It was. And then, of course, they won the election, making her the first female, first Black, and first Asian American vice president.
It's hard to believe how much she's achieved in her career.
I know. It's truly remarkable.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From her early life and influences all the way to her historic role as vice president. But there's still so much more to unpack.
Right. So next time we're going to dive deeper into her political positions, those controversial moments, and what they might tell us about her future as a leader.
I'm excited to see where this goes.
Me too. So join us next time for part 2 of our deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris.
All right, so last time we left off with Kamala Harris becoming vice president.
A truly historic moment.
It really was. But now I think it would be really interesting to look closer at her political positions.
Yeah, we've talked about some of the highlights of her career, but now let's get into the specifics. Like, what does she actually believe in? What are the issues she's passionate about?
Right. And I think a good place to start is criminal justice reform.
Okay. Yeah, because that's definitely an area where she's been both praised and criticized,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't talk about Kamala Harris without talking about her background as a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
And some people view that experience as a negative, right? They say she was too tough on crime, that she didn't do enough to address issues like mass incarceration and racial bias in the system.
Right, and they point to specific cases, like the case of Daniel Larson, as evidence that she was more focused on getting convictions than on ensuring justice.
Yeah, that case definitely drew a lot of criticism. But her supporters argue that she was just doing her job, that she was following the law as it existed at the time.
Right. And they point to programs like Back on Track as proof that she was also interested in rehabilitation, in giving people a second chance.
So it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
It really is. And then there's the issue of the death penalty, which is obviously a very sensitive topic.
Yeah, as Attorney General, she defended California's death penalty in court.
Which obviously upset a lot of people who are opposed to capital punishment.
But at the same time, she's also expressed personal reservations about it.
Yeah, she's said that she has concerns about its effectiveness as a deterrent, and she's questioned whether it's truly just.
So again, we see this nuance in her views. It's not a black and white issue for her.
Right, and I think that's something we see a lot with her, this willingness to grapple with the complexities of issues.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about taking a hardline stance. It's about trying to find solutions that actually work.
Okay, so let's move on to social issues. One area where she's been a very strong advocate is LGBTQ plus rights.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a vocal supporter of marriage equality long before it became mainstream.
Yeah, and she even refused to defend California's Proposition 8 in court because she believed it was discriminatory.
And when the Supreme Court finally legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, she didn't just celebrate. She officiated weddings for same-sex couples.
Yeah, which is just awesome. It shows how much she personally cares about this issue.
Yeah, she's not just paying lip service. She's putting her beliefs into action.
Right. And she's also been a big supporter of transgender rights, even calling for an investigation into the death of Roxana Hernandez, a transgender woman who died in IC custody.
So she's really focused on protecting the rights of the most vulnerable members of the LGBTQ+ community. And of course, we can't talk about social issues without talking about reproductive rights, especially in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, that's a huge issue right now. And Kamala Harris has been very clear about her stance. She's a strong supporter of abortion rights, and she's vowed to fight for federal legislation to protect access to safe and legal abortion.
So she's not shying away from this issue, even though it's incredibly divisive.
No, she's not. She's made it very clear where she stands.
Okay, so let's talk about climate change, another big issue of our time.
Right. And Kamala Harris has been pretty vocal about her support for policies aimed at tackling climate change.
Yeah, like investing in renewable energy, transitioning away from fossil fuels.
And she was actually an early co-sponsor of the Green New Deal.
Wow, so she's not afraid to take bold stances on these issues.
But of course, she's also faced criticism from some environmental groups for not going far enough.
Yeah, they say she hasn't done enough to crack down on things like fracking, and that her support for carbon capture technologies is misguided.
Right. So even on an issue like climate change, where there's broad agreement on the need for action, there's still disagreement on how to best move forward.
And I think her position on immigration is another good example of that. I mean, this is an issue that's obviously very personal for her, given her own family history.
Yeah, she's the daughter of immigrants, so she's seen firsthand the challenges and opportunities that come with immigration.
And she's been a strong advocate for comprehensive immigration reform.
Including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants.
But she's also been criticized for her record on immigration, particularly during her time as Attorney General.
Yeah, some people say she wasn't tough enough on undocumented immigrants, while others say she was too focused on enforcement and not enough on addressing the root causes of migration.
So again, she's trying to find a middle ground, a balance between compassion and enforcement, which is never easy.
All right, so let's move on to foreign policy. As vice president, she played a key role in shaping U.S. foreign policy, especially when it came to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, she was very vocal in her support for Ukraine, calling for continued military and humanitarian aid.
And she really framed the conflict as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism.
Which resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah. But her approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been more nuanced.
Yeah, she's reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to Israel's security, but she's also expressed concerns about the ongoing conflict with Palestinians and the need for a two-state solution.
So she's trying to find a balance there, acknowledging the complexities of the situation.
Right. And she's also made it a priority to strengthen ties with allies in Europe and Asia.
Recognizing the importance of international cooperation in addressing global challenges.
So it's a more multilateral approach to foreign policy.
Now, one area where she differs from Biden is on economic issues.
Yeah, she's adopted a more populist economic agenda.
Yeah, she's really focused on addressing issues like income inequality and making sure that the economy works for everyone, not just the wealthy.
So she's proposed things like raising the minimum wage, expanding access to affordable health care, making college more affordable.
All policies that are aimed at helping working families.
Right. So we see this focus on economic justice, on creating a more equitable society.
So as we look at all these different policy areas, it's clear that Kamala Harris is a complex figure, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. She's got this interesting mix of progressive and more moderate views, and she's not afraid to evolve on issues as she learns more.
Right, and I think that's what makes her so fascinating. She's not easily categorized. She's not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, and she's always pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes her such a compelling figure. She's a trailblazer. She's someone who's constantly breaking barriers and inspiring others to do the same.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still one more piece of the puzzle that we need to address.
The controversies.
Right, and we're going to tackle those head on next time. We're going to look at the criticisms that have been leveled against her, the defenses offered by her supporters, and what it all means for her as a leader.
So get ready for some tough conversations.
Because we're not shying away from anything.
And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide what we think of Kamala Harris and her legacy.
Exactly. So join us next time for the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we're back, ready to finish up this deep dive.
I am. We've covered so much about Kamala Harris already.
We really have. I mean, from her childhood in Oakland all the way to the White House.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
It has. But you know, there's one more thing we need to talk about, and that's the controversies.
Right, because no politician is perfect.
Definitely not. And Kamala Harris has definitely had her fair share of criticism over the years.
Yeah, I mean, she's been called out for her record as a prosecutor, for her handling of police misconduct cases, for her relationship with Willie Brown, and even for being too ambitious.
Right. So let's unpack all of that.
Okay, let's start with her time as a prosecutor. I mean, that's probably the biggest source of controversy, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because some people argue that she was too focused on getting convictions, that she didn't do enough to protect the rights of the accused.
Right, like they point to cases where her office resisted efforts to overturn wrongful convictions, even when there was new evidence suggesting that the person might be innocent,
Exactly. And they say that she was too quick to seek the death penalty.
which is obviously a very controversial issue.
It is, but, her supporters, they push back on those criticisms. They say that she was just doing her job, that she was following the law.
Right, and that she was always tough but fair.
Mm-hmm. And they point to programs like Back on Track as evidence that she was also interested in rehabilitation, in giving people a second chance.
Yeah, and they argue that she can't be judged by today's standards
Mm-hmm.
because the criminal justice system has changed a lot since she was a prosecutor.
Right. So it's complicated. There are valid arguments on both sides.
There really are. And it's up to each individual to decide what they think of her record.
Okay. So what about her handling of police misconduct cases? That's another area that's drawn a lot of criticism.
Yeah, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the national reckoning over police brutality.
Right, because people were looking to her to be a champion for police reform, and some people felt like she didn't do enough.
Yeah, they point to cases where she chose not to prosecute police officers who were accused of excessive force or even killing unarmed civilians.
And they say that she was too deferential to law enforcement, that she wasn't willing to hold them accountable.
Right. But again, her supporters argue that she was just following the law, that she couldn't bring charges unless she had enough evidence to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt.
And they point to her work on things like implicit bias training for police officers as evidence that she was trying to make a difference.
Yeah, and, she did become more vocal in her support for police reform after the murder of George Floyd.
Right. So her stance on that issue did evolve over time.
It did. But, some people still feel like she was more of a follower than a leader on this issue.
Yeah, that she was reacting to public pressure rather than setting the agenda.
Right. Okay, so another criticism that's often leveled against Kamala Harris is that she's too ambitious, that she's more interested in advancing her own career than in serving the people.
Yeah. And a lot of that criticism stems from her relationship with Willie Brown.
Right. Because, he helped her early on in her career,
Yeah.
and some people saw that as her using him to get ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are those who say that she flip-flops on issues, that she changes her positions depending on what's politically expedient.
Yeah. Like, they say she's not really a true progressive, that she's more of a moderate who's just trying to appeal to both sides.
Right. But her supporters say that she's just being pragmatic, that she's willing to compromise in order to get things done, and that her willingness to evolve on issues is a sign of growth, not weakness.
Right. So again, it really comes down to how you interpret her actions. There's no easy answer.
There really isn't. And I think that's what makes her such a fascinating figure. She's complex, she's contradictory, and she's definitely not afraid to break the mold.
Yeah. I mean, she's the daughter of immigrants. She's a woman of color. She's achieved things that no one thought were possible.
And she's done it all while facing incredible scrutiny and criticism.
Right. And that's why I think it's so important to understand her story, to look at both the good and the bad, and to make up our own minds about who she is and what she represents.
I agree. Because she's a powerful symbol of progress, of the changing face of America.
She is. And whether you love her or hate her, there's no denying that she's made a huge impact on American politics.
Absolutely. So I think we've done a pretty good job of covering Kamala Harris's life and career.
I think so, too. We've gone through her whole Wikipedia page. We've talked about her accomplishments, her controversies, her beliefs.
Yeah, we've really tried to give a complete picture of who she is.
Exactly. And hopefully our listeners have learned something new along the way.
I hope so, too, because I think it's important to be informed about our leaders, to understand their motivations, and to hold them accountable.
I agree. And, even if you don't agree with everything Kamala Harris has done or said, I think it's important to acknowledge the significance of her journey.
Absolutely. She's broken down so many barriers, and she's paved the way for others to follow in her footsteps.
She has, and that's something to celebrate, regardless of your political beliefs.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you for listening. And until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.